It was about 1850, which would be 165 years ago, that this particular vineyard was planted. It's a Niagara vineyard, Niagara grapes, and at that point in time, these grapes were used almost totally for table fruit. Now, what that means is these grapes were picked in like 40-pound lugs, and then they were transported to a packing house down below here, and there they were packed in 5 and 10-pound containers, taken to the lake, picked up by a steamboat, taken to Canandaigua and the Canandaigua Pier, where they were transferred from the steamboat to a train. And then that train would take these grapes to the major metropolitan areas here in the Northeast, meaning Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And it wasn't until probably the 1870s, 1880s that winemaking really started in earnest here in the Finger Lakes region. In fact, in Naples, the Maxfield wine cellars started in about 1860, and then Widmer's started in 1888. And quite frankly, Widmer's is a company I started working for once I graduated from Cornell University in 1964. So these hillsides were perfect for grape production, in that they're fairly close to the water, so they protected the grapevines in the spring from the frost because the water was cool, and they protected the grapes themselves in the fall because the water was warm. So we had a fairly long growing season for grapes here, for table grapes. Now, add to that the fact that the best mode of transportation back in the 1850s was water, because water is smooth. You've got a boat, you can go fairly fast. The next fastest transportation was a horse and buggy, which was not very smooth, and grapes don't want to be jostled around a lot. So, but you didn't want to have to travel a great distance to take your fruit to market either, meaning from the standpoint of jostling the fruit. So that's why the grapes were planted here, they were picked here, repacked here, taken to the boat, traveled to Canandaigua, loaded on the train for those far eastern cities that I mentioned before. Now, the table fruit market kind of went to hell in the early 1900s, because that's when we had more reliable transportation of the rail, which could actually bring grapes from California. And that's probably when we started to have more of these grapes go into winemaking rather than into table fruit. Now, that whole valley was covered with grapes, to the left of the valley and to the right of the valley, until we came to a period in the 1920s called Prohibition. And the table market had already left, and then in the 1920s, when Prohibition came, many of these vineyards went out of production. Our particular vineyard here, now called Arbor Hill, was one of the more fortunate ones, which apparently still had a market and was able to continue in that period of time. It's a fairly steep vineyard with narrow rows on a steep hillside. So unfortunately today we have to, just like it was 165 years ago, this vineyard has to be hand-picked, hand-pruned. Everything is done by hand. I will sometimes get the question as to how long a vineyard will last. And I tell people I don't know, because my oldest vineyard's 165 years old. And normally the reason a vineyard goes out of production tends to be more from the standpoint of its, what would I say, more from the standpoint of its viability economically. Now, to tell you the truth, if I really knew how much it cost me to operate this vineyard economically, it's probably not viable today, but it's a part of history, and I still make wine from it, so I'm going to continue on as long as I'm able to continue making wine.